Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For starters, I should like to extend you all a very, very warm welcome to colleagues and friends of ISAS to come at this book discussion this afternoon. Our distinguished speaker is the author of this important tome that we're going to discuss, Dr. Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekananda International Foundation, the renowned Delhi-based think tank with which most, if not all of you, must be familiar. He's a retired member of the prestigious Indian Foreign Service. He had served in the MEA and posts in Moscow, London, and Ankara. He has been Deputy National Advisor, which, as you are aware, is a key policy position in the union or central government. His principal forte, and we lunched together this afternoon, his principal forte, as I gathered, was strategic and defense studies. He has an MPhil and PhD from the School of International Studies, JNU. He's authored 3 books and a raft of articles on subjects of his interest. The book we shall be talking about today is an extremely well-written, comprehensive account of how India confronts its myriad national security challenges. He culls his extrapolations, tapping on his prodigious experiences, and proffers the thesis that rather than tactical remedies, India's response should be a coherent and strategic one based on strong institutions. But how is this to be done? I shan't attempt to steal his thunder, and I would like Dr. Arvind Gupta to speak to the query himself. So, Director, you have the floor. Next 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhary. It was a great pleasure meeting you at lunch today. Of course, I had heard a lot about you. Professor Muni used to be here, who was my good friend, and he used to talk about it here. I think you used to be in some other building earlier. Yes, I had once visited many years ago. But thanks to Raja, I have a chance to meet you all. It's a pity that he's not here today. Raja and I go back almost 3 decades. And in some sense, I think this book is also the result of a number of discussions we have held with Raja Mohan and others over the years. Now, as you mentioned, this book is about India's national security. Is it working?
Yeah.
India's national security institutions.
A little louder.
Now, in 1999, the government of India set up a new institution which was never thought of earlier, and it was called the National Security Council. It was thought of in the sense that there was a debate, and in the early 90s there had been some debate, but they finally set it up in 1999. And I had the good fortune of having been sent on deputation from the Ministry of External Affairs to this institution, which was the National Security Council Secretariat. That means Secretariat to the National Security Council.
Who was the first NSA?
The first NSA was Mr. Brijesh Mishra. And the first Deputy NSA was Mr. Satish Chandra, who was our High Commissioner in Pakistan. He was a career diplomat, still associated with the Vivekananda International Foundation. So I worked with him in the formative years of the National Security Council. So I worked straight 8 years, kind of left my Foreign Service regular career. And that's where I started kind of getting a feel of how complex and complicated national security management can be. And I also realized that India had been struggling right since 1947 to get some institution together which would take a holistic look at National Security Council. And we learned our first lesson, a bitter lesson, in 1962, the India-China war. Between 1947 and 1962, we had illustrious, of course, people, army, etc. 1947-48, we had this first war on Kashmir. But when you came to the institutions, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru and his deputy Krishna Menon, they were the institutions by themselves. So what they thought was the foreign policy, what they thought was the defense policy, and there was very little by way of thinking holistically about the institution, about security. And 1962, I think, if you analyze the weaknesses, one weakness was that we did not have institutions which would bring together different strands which go into making of national security and have an accurate and objective assessment. And very often, and Amitindu is sitting here, the economy was kept out. And it's a sad story that even today, economy is hardly factored into the calculations of national security. Now, of course, there is a greater realization. Even the latest books which have come out in Indian economy, etc. Even if you look at Niti Ayog's India at 75, and they're looking at various sectors and looking ahead, etc. National security doesn't factor in. And similarly, those who were planning for national security, they had no idea about the resources, where the resources would come from. We were shouting, we should have defense budget at 3% of the GDP, etc. But where will you get that 3% of GDP from? And top of this, issues like the research and development. So you had two strands of research and development. One was the civilian strand. So you had research on agriculture, you had research on space, you had research on medicine, and so on and so forth. And then you have the DRDO strand, the Defense Research Organization, Research and Development Organization, DRDO. They were doing the research for defense forces, but totally separated. No talking to each other, working in silos. The DRDO would not know what is being developed in the civilian labs. The civilian labs would have not the foggiest idea what are the needs of the defense forces. So two very important aspects of India's national development, national security, they were all working in silos. So I think when the National Security Council was set up, for the first time, this that we started realizing that national security must be treated holistically. But that's not just to pay the lip service. You have to do a whole institutional change, and you have to do a whole mindset change, which is what the National Security Council, which was set up in 1999, and now it's nearly 20 years old, that was set up. So I happened to be there at the formative years, and in all I spent 11 years and did two stints there. One as Joint Secretary and one as the head of the National Security Council Secretariat. Then I realized that even for me, being inside the system, it was so difficult to understand national security. So people outside who would often talk about, big things about, let's say even Indo-Pacific now, if you take the current vocabulary, or you talk about Act East policy, etc. But very often, these were mere words, concepts, very useful concepts. They focused your thinking, but where was that institutional backup that is required to take these ideas forward? And that's why very often we hear this criticism that India has an Act East policy, but where is India? India is not there in Southeast Asia, hardly there. We are waiting for India to do, these are the kind of, even today only I heard these comments, we are hoping that India will act, India will come. So while these kind of remarks are passed, but when you ask why is it that India cannot build a multimodal project in Myanmar for the last 20 years, why is it that these projects go for so long? It is because our institutional apparatus hasn't come together. Maybe there's some weaknesses there. And this is true of our developmental institutions. This is also true of our national security institutions. And so this is the book about the key national security institutions, which includes the armed forces institutions, which includes very important, the paramilitary forces. You know, today the internal security, management of internal security, or even to conduct this mammoth exercise of elections will not happen, cannot happen, unless you have the paramilitary forces, you use them and you know their expertise, and unless you strengthen them. Very few people know that we have about, few people in the sense people who are outside the country, perhaps the foreigners, we have about 8 very big paramilitary forces, and the total strength, combined strength of them is more than that of the army now, or almost equal. So 1 million people. And these paramilitaries, who all fall under the Ministry of Home Affairs, most of them, they also have to be resourced. They also have to be trained. They also have to be coordinated. And somewhere they have to come into the overall national security system. And particularly when you talk about border management, which means your relationship with Bangladesh, your relationship with Pakistan, with Myanmar, we have huge borders with China, and then we have huge coastal coastline, 7,500 kilometers of coastline, 15,000 plus kilometers of land borders, terrains. On one hand, you have temperatures as low as -40, on the other you have temperatures as high as +50, all at the same time. Now this border has to be managed, and today if you don't manage your borders properly, you will mess up your relationship with the neighbors. I mean, Bangladesh, we have the longest border, 4,000 and I think 100 kilometers. And you know very well what is the terrain there. And you know how the issues of illegal migration and all that happens. Now, these are all national security issues. But very few people talk about this. Then internal security has been an equally important aspect of our overall national security. It's not just the defense. On internal security, as you know, from 1947 onwards, we have had a variety of insurgencies in the Northeast, militancies, terrorism. Each one single, I mean, any of incidents that happens can derail development, can derail national security. But they go, unnoticed or unsung. Some of them are unsung heroes. Military is very important. The defense forces are very important. But what about our police? Actually, the first line of defense is intelligence and police in any country. And in police, for instance, we still have the police, because we have a system of centers and state governments have their own police forces, etc. And if you combine all the police forces, there are about 2 million policemen that India has, or should have, but it has about 500,000 short. So 500,000 short, then what happens to the policing? On the UN parameters, the per capita that we should have, a number of policemen per 200 population, there should be 1, and we have much less than that. So I think these internal security challenges, which often morph into the challenges, with the overall national security challenges, they have to be addressed. They cannot be addressed unless you have proper institutions. And it's not just the police or the defense, which is the visible aspect of national security. It's all backed by intelligence, for instance, both internal and external. And external intelligence has to work together with foreign policy. So what is the link between the foreign policy and external intelligence? What kind of a role these various institutions which are there, they play? So I think this book brings together many of these things together, and how they, firstly, what are these institutions? It identifies those, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those institutions, and how they come together. Another very important aspect of national security is technology today. Today, everything, you see, India has a reasonably good track on technology, and has a reasonably good track of technology and security, in the sense that the government started investing into nuclear research, for instance, even before India became independent. The Tata Research Institution was set up in 1944. Then Bhabha came and he led the Indian effort for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and which also had this other program, and which culminated into a strategic program, etc. India also set up right in the beginning. So there's a long history, which also briefly this book goes into a history of how DRDO was set up, how BARC, the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, was set up, how did the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research set up, what did they do. So we had these various scientific research institutions, agriculture research, pharmaceutical research, all this was set up. But again, as I said, the link with security was not easily established, and everything was done in a very quiet manner, particularly on the nuclear side, etc. But today, technology plays a so important role, particularly in the cyber area and space. So both these aspects are also covered in this book. I think space is emerging as a new frontier. Of course, there is a whole international regime on space technology, space security, on space and application of space technologies, peaceful uses of space technologies. But we are seeing space is increasingly getting used for military purposes as well. Surveillance, for instance, satellites. So India has had this ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, which has always been focused on the peaceful uses. So we have a huge application in the education sector, health sector, agriculture, mining, this, that, etc. But India also needs, because of huge Indian Ocean, our borders, and many of these borders need special attention. So how is space being used for national security? That's another area I think that looks into. Then cyber has become a very important cyber security. In the last 20 years, India has taken a number of steps. 2013, we came up with a new cybersecurity policy. A large number of cybersecurity institutions have been set up. These institutions, what is the state of their preparedness? Some are working, some are not working, and I think particularly in cyber, or cybersecurity industry, we still need to, we have excellent brains, but we don't have a cybersecurity industry worth its name. No indigenous cybersecurity industry. So how technology, particularly in the strategic area, the focus on indigenization is very important. So who does this indigenization research? How is it done? What kind of resources are given to them? And how do they link up with the overall foreign policy, defense policy, national security policy? So this book is also an effort to explain that. Then you have a foreign policy. I take it as an important aspect of national security. If you look at, say, till about Kargil, I would say, foreign policy did not focus on national security the way it should have done. At least this is my critique of it. But this is now beginning to change. Foreign policy, yes, you maintain your relations with your neighbors, you maintain relations with the rest of the world. Yes, you take part in international organizations, you come up with large initiatives, etc. You see, India for many decades was essentially not a very well-developed, it was not a well-developed, economically not well-developed. So foreign policy tried to make up with some of our weaknesses. So we punched above our weight in many areas. So which means that you have lots of good speeches, and you have very good statements, and you have good engagement. Non-alignment was an effort to keep yourself away from both the blocks and keep your independence, etc. So these are very good experiences we got. But in the end, it is all about national power, comprehensive national power, of which military is one part, economic is another part, and education, and everything, more or less everything comes into that. This began to happen only after 1991, when Indian economy was opened up. That's why the connect between economy and security is very strong, but not understood, and not even probably researched properly. So I think today in the foreign policy, the national security has national security and national development both. These have come to occupy a very important role. But is our foreign policy institution is geared to deal with such complex challenges which are arising on the foreign policy front and which have national security implications? That's something that it discusses. It discusses the structure of our foreign policy establishment. It discusses where I think certain work needs to be done. See, one thing that we need to do, for instance, is accurate assessment of what is going on is so very important. If you look at the United States, for instance, they have so many think tanks. They have this Office of Net Assessment, and they have this very close link between the establishment and the think tanks, but not so in India. Little bit on the economic side, but not so much on the strategic side. But that is the situation which you see. So, role of think tanks. How do you make accurate assessments of what is going on is so very important for making good policy. But even today, having 20 years of now the National Security Council, which tends to promote research in think tanks, etc., and tends to bring many things together, but still I think there are a lot of work that needs to be done. In particular, we need to imbibe modern technologies, scenario building, and looking at predictions and big data analytics. Now, these are the areas which should come into the foreign policy domain itself. Our new generation of diplomats, they have to understand it. People are very intelligent, but then intelligent people can also make a mistake. But I think if we had institutional methods, institutional strengths of dealing with data, dealing with history, dealing with huge amount of data which is coming, and then making pictures, which is not possible thanks to computers, thanks to big data analytics, thanks to artificial intelligence, thanks to so many other cyber. I think these things, horizon scans, looking 50 years from now. Now, these are the methods which must come into our foreign policy methodologies, which has not happened as yet, but this book talks about that. And where does it in decision making? You see, in a democracy there is always an issue. Where does an institution like National Security Council fit into the decision making structures of the government of India? The government, as you know, is a democracy. Each minister is an elected minister, but not the National Security Advisor. National Security Advisor is a person appointed by the government of India by a fiat, by an executive order. And yet today, the National Security Advisor has come to occupy such an important role in overall the framework of our national security. And these recent incidents also have shown that. So how does it deal as an equal with the elected ministers, who is a foreign minister and who is a defense minister, and National Security Council? What is its role, or how is it defined in the overall governing structure of the government of India? I think there are some issues which need to be tackled. So this book talks about that as well. So I think how the National Security Council will grow in future, how it will bring together different stakeholders, and how it will look at the nitty-gritty, even issues like the allocation of resources amongst different armed forces. Army, Navy, Air Force is such a difficult task, although all the three come under one minister, that is the defense minister. But today, armed forces are not the only, national security is not about the armed forces. Armed forces also require people. Armed forces also require research and development. Armed forces also require logistics. Armed forces also link with the Ministry of External Affairs, Foreign Policy. Now, the role of defense diplomacy, for instance, has been kind of understated, neglected. So what should be the role in this overall security framework? What should be a role of the Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of Defense, two independent, powerful ministries in any government, but how should they come together? and what should be the role of National Security Advisor, and how they should all come together. What should be the role of defense diplomacy? Do we require today's system of posting a few defense advisors here and there, etc.? Is that good enough? No. India is now, I think, thanks to Make in India and other such programs, is going to become a manufacturing hub. And defense is a very important part of it. Cyber is a very important part of it. Now, if you have a defense industry growing in India, but do you have enough demand for it? Probably you will have to go for defense exports, which is something that India has been very reluctant, shy, not done very much. But I see in the next 5 to 10 years, defense exports will increase. Now, defense exports don't happen just like that. So, defense exports will become an important part of not only just the industry, but also of our defense policy or our foreign policy. So, how does this whole system of defense advisors that we have, and the manufacturing system that we will be building, and the DRDO, how should they come together so that a coordinated approach to defense exports and defense diplomacy and many other things that which fall into defense diplomacy, a coordinated approach can be worked out. So this book also looks into that. I think I'm almost there. And finally, I would like to say that I think the challenge that India is facing is faced by many other countries also. Different countries have different systems. So in places like China, perhaps, it's a top-down approach. You give an order and things get done. In a place like the US, they were the first one to set up a National Security Council by an act of Congress way back in 1947. They have developed many of these methodologies, quite a lot, but they were a global power. They were a global power, they had global interests, other countries had small interests, etc. But now I think India is changing. India is at the cusp of now breaking out, let me put it this way. The partition cornered India into a small South Asia box. That is, thing is changing. Act East policy is one example where India is now looking and is now establishing linkages here. The rise of concepts like the Indo-Pacific gives India a far bigger stage to play. Because our strategic interest, it's not that India is expansionist, aggressive, no, nothing of this sort. Our strategic interest, our survival, and historically so, is linked right up to the Arabs and lands beyond up to Africa, that is the all of Indian Ocean, and right up to here the South China Sea, and the Pacific Ocean. This is the area, even today, a lot of our trade happens, etc. from these points. Now, India has to engage with these countries, and with engagement, you will have to really, earlier we were content with sources of insecurity, which essentially meant China, Pakistan, and that's the end of the matter. Then came terrorism, okay, you do that. But now if terrorism is having global links, so even on the internal security front, we are having a large number of working groups, for instance, on counter-terrorism, something like 30 countries we have. And as you know, Prime Minister has been talking about the UN Convention on Terrorism, international terrorism, how to combat. So India is playing that big role, and Masood Azhar's thing today, we talked about it this morning, is one example. So I think India's engagement, whether it's an economic front, whether it is on defense front, whether it is on many other fronts, technology front, is going to expand exponentially. And as India rises, India becomes, today is what, 5th or 6th largest economy, it will become 4th, 3rd in due course of time, if it maintains even 7-8% of growth rate, and I think India will be completely transformed. But we will also, in that engagement, to project the right kind of India, to contribute to stability and peace and stability, which we are doing now in many ways. Look at the HADR, how Indian Navy is involved, or how in so many evacuations that India has done from crisis areas. So our engagement is now growing. And similarly, we also have to defend ourselves from the onslaught. I mean, this book also has a whole chapter on what are the sources of insecurity that India has, and where do they arise? It goes into the history. So the partition is, the colonial legacy, that is one part of it, dealing with China, dealing with Pakistan, China-Pakistan nexus, Pakistan's growing influence in the Indian Ocean, China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean, and China-Pakistan, the economic corridor. All these have ultimately security implications. Now, how will India deal with the security implications? You must have a correct understanding and correct institutions. And each of these institutions, we can create institutions, but if you don't resource them properly and don't equip them with well-trained people, and if they don't properly find a place in the overall setup, then I think it will be very difficult. So this book basically makes the point that national security, the sources of instability and insecurity, they are becoming more complex. We will require an institutional mechanism, and we will require robust institutions, and we will require well-coordinated institutions. So our leadership also will have to change its mindset. And many factors would have to come together for India to feel secure. I don't think, particularly I kept basically students in mind. You can read this book in two ways. One is you can read this book as a primer. So it tells you about what are the institutions. So number of, as I said, the complexity of India's institutions, that is explained. So it will probably useful for researchers who want to talk about India's security management, or even students who want to learn something about it. But it also leaves a number of pointers for the future, and that again for us also. So I think this is where I had pitched this book, but I'll be very happy to take any questions on this. This book, I believe you don't have a copy. I have been discussing with Raja, but anyway, this is probably available on Kindle and
yeah, Jordan was trying to access it, but thank you very much, Director Gupta. Let's give him a hand. Well, it's a book discussion, so might I initiate it with some queries of mine on which I was reflecting as we were speaking, because as you heard, I was not able to read the book myself, though I've read some reviews of it. You do fill a vacuum in the extant literature on foreign policy, because normally, I mean, in countries like ours, developing countries, when one discusses foreign policy, one focuses on policy itself. I mean, you do this is how it should be done, etc. As the systems become more complex, and this is what Western literature tells us, the system becomes complex, you start focusing on institutions, how foreign policy is made, how it's evolved. You mentioned America a couple of times. I mean, just immediately after the Cold War, there was this book called Decision Making by Graham Allison, obviously. I mean, he had argued that, you see, policy is the result of pulls and pushes of these various institutions operating in the system. It is not necessarily a rational outcome. Mathematically, it cannot be a rational outcome. It depends on who is superior in putting the pulls and pushes. And therefore, by definition, policy is an irrational outcome of pulls and pushes of bureaucratic institutions under the political master, which he called the prophet. In other words, yes, the institutions that you have described, the military, the foreign office, they used to say that the foreign policy is too important to be left to the foreign office, just as defense is too important to be left to the defense ministries and even the generals. Yes. So you have you do justice. In India, of course, I would assume that there was already some palpability that the influence of security concerns in foreign policy making was lacking. So those days you used to get even things like novels written by people like General Sundarji, Seven Blind Men of India. Yes, I mean, these are hints that there's a gap in foreign policy making. I see two issues. I don't know enough about the internal working of the Indian mechanism, but two issues with regard to this. Number one is the structure of the National Security Council. I'll be fair. I mean, I myself looked at Indian National Security Council for our own reasons, just as I have looked at Pakistan's. In Pakistan, the Security Council is obviously stronger. I mean, you see, the forces are more effectively represented in the system. In India, could it be that according some kind of a political priority to security in policy making would necessitate giving the uniformed element of governance some acknowledgement of status and power, which could be translated to power, policy power. And there was a kind of wariness among the political masters in doing that. You know, I mean, would you let the general sit as your equal? Number one. Number two, the nature of the Indian political organization. You mentioned America, but United States. But the United States is a presidential form. I mean, the president from 48 onwards, and Kissinger, Brzezinski, etc. They have sat in the White House, chaired NSC, advised the president. In India, which is a parliamentary system, where ministers are primus inter and the prime minister is a primus inter pares in theory, of course. I mean, I understand, of course, Modi is very powerful, but that's another matter. The ministers have their own responsibilities, as have their states. So there, to have a council, which is a non-elected, non-political council, where as it is, you are a bit chary of giving the generals their big say in particularly in resource allocations, etc. And then you have the problems of different ministerial responsibilities, and yet the team working as a council with corporate responsibility. And you have the states who have their own positions. In security terms, I would assume states like West Bengal or Rajputana or something, or Punjab, which is closer to potential sources of threat. They may think that, okay, this should be the policy because we do not want to be unnecessarily open to external threats, you see. And a policy undertaken in Delhi might expose us to the kind of threats. So that is another problem the Indian system has. Now, do you see these as problems? And I'm sure your book addresses these. I welcome this as literature, and I'm very pleased that you have addressed something of this question, because these questions have actually have been in our minds. That is India effective, Indian system effective enough to have a coherent policy such as a nuclear doctrine? I mean, you have the Pakistanis come out every now and then saying that, okay, I mean, all spectrum, deterrence, etc. Is there an Indian person who can say that this is the nuclear doctrine of India, and therefore, in case of a nuclear war, we will follow this doctrine? Is it possible to do in India politically and otherwise? So, I mean, this is just
okay. I think you have raised some many questions and very important questions, and some of them I have dealt with here in this. One is, you are absolutely right. You see, National Security Council in a democratic system, as I explained, is a kind of a very difficult institution. Who is the National Security Advisor? What is his role? The others are elected members, and yet you have a National Security Advisor who because he coordinates a lot of security policies, he tend to become very powerful, etc. So this was probably the reason why in 1999, when the National Security Council was set up, it was set up as an advisory body. So it doesn't have any powers. So it cannot dictate to the Ministry of Defense, do this, do that. It cannot dictate to Ministry of External Affairs, do this, do that. What it can do is, it can bring the two ministers together, pose a problem and pose a solution. Suggest a solution also, and if they like it, then this solution then goes back to the system, which is the cabinet committee system, which means it goes back to the Cabinet Committee on Security. And then finally, Cabinet Committee on Security is the last. They then dictate, all right, you want to expand the Navy, you buy, okay, we grant you so much resources. That's an allocation of resources. So National Security Council essentially becomes a think tank in a way. But that itself is a very useful function, because the composition of the National Security Council is exactly the same as that of the Cabinet Committee on Security. Same ministers. So this is what they have been trying. But I think there is...
The point is, you have ministers, but you don't have the forces.
I'm coming to that. As far as the forces are concerned, the generals are concerned, they don't sit on any cabinet committee on security. Actually, it is not their place. because the Indian Constitution, the armed forces are subservient to the civilian authority. So the defense minister sits there, that's more than enough. And it is through defense minister everything passes. And I think that will not change either. It doesn't have to change. But because they have the expertise, because it is they who finally advise the government on the national security, the threats, etc., what should be done, should not be done, etc. So there are many ways of co-opting them in various forums. So for instance, Cabinet Committee on Security will always have, if they want, they can have these as special invitees. And that's why we were trying to build another institution which we have not succeeded. That was the Chief of Defence Staff, CDS,
Yes.
Chief of Defence Staff. He would be finally the if and when set up.
Something like a chairman.
Yeah, at the moment it is the Chairman Chief of Staff Committee. He performs that role, but he has no powers. He himself is one of the chiefs. But if he's a naval chief, he cannot tell the army chief, please divert all the resources to me. He can't do that. Nor will his armed forces, Navy will like it very much then. But we need somebody who's can do that. That CDS has not happened as yet because of these very reasons. But I think what has happened is the National Security Council, and it has associated structures. It's not, National Security Council is one. It has many other, like I was the head of the National Security Council Secretariat. That is where all the thrashing out is done. So papers will be prepared, the resource positions will be taken. There are many other institutions which I have discussed here. And then a very nicely discussed view is presented to the Cabinet Committee, to the National Security Council and the Cabinet Committee on Security. So that is how it has been working. But I think there's already some talk by way of review, because we have functioned, we have had a functioning National Security Council for 20 years, whether it has delivered or not. So that kind of a discussion is going on, and I think some reform are, maybe it will be strengthened a little bit, some powers perhaps will be given. But in Indian system, probably everybody will have to be co-opted before you do. So it is not that presidential form of system. Most of the National Security Council, there are I think about 50 now in the world. Most of them are in the presidential form of system.
Yes,
Central
that's,
Asia, Russia,
That's the
and
one.
US, but others are also now trying to. Japan has set up very late, and I think 2011 or 12, UK also set up. In fact, we were probably the early parliamentary form of system which set up. So let us see how it. Essentially, it should be a functioning system. So even if you set up a mechanisms of people talk to each other, it doesn't matter whether you talk on a phone. Many of these decisions, as you know very well, many of the decisions are not taken on paper. They are taken with the. The second is about nuclear doctrine. Actually, we have a nuclear doctrine, and it's very well spelled, and it is a public nuclear doctrine. We have 2 pages. 2003 we came out with, and it's very well set up. As a part of that, we have a strategic force command. We have a nuclear command authority, which has 2 portions. One is political portion segment, and one is the executive segment. And the whole of government approach is taken in that, and they're very powerful, and a lot of powers have been given. So nuclear command authority, which is under nuclear doctrine, that's working very well. And in fact, there are 2 systems which I think in India they are beginning to function. One is this nuclear command authority. The other is from a different segment, that is the this GST Council, where the states are coming in. This is an innovation in an Indian system, that every state sits and takes a decision by consensus on taxation issues. Now, I think on some of the national security issues, you mentioned that states are not involved. You are absolutely right, and I think that is one shortcoming and a gap we have. The next step of reform should be to bring the states onto the national security decision making. It can be done in many ways, and I have made some suggestions here. For instance, the National Security Council, like the Indian Economic Service or Indian Statistical Service and many others, they can have their representatives sit in various ministries. They can have their representatives sit in various states. So there you can look at border management issues, West Bengal and how the Northeast, they interact with Bangladesh. So those local concerns should also come in. I think we need certainly a system where the state governments should come on board. Right now, I think that is one gap. So that is, I take that point, and some discussion is there on that. And I don't know whether there was any other question. Nuclear doctrine I have answered, states I have answered, generals I have answered.
Okay, all right. We will now open it for, yes, if you will identify yourself, even though I should know you all, but we want it for our records, etc.
Gurdeep Singh from PTI.
Yeah.
You mentioned AI, big data. These things were just recent months. We've heard it in ministers saying, and Indian defense sector is trying to look at it. What is the exact state or status of that getting into? And is there capability in having that put together?
See, AI is already got the attention of the government, and Niti Aayog had set up a group. I think they are how to develop AI capabilities in the country. And this, of course, AI will be a dual use. So this will be used by in all applications. But certainly the focus is going to be in AI, and that's the future. In the artificial intelligence arena, the Department of Science and Technology has set up several centers of excellence, like in IIT Delhi, in Indian Institute of Bangalore, and many other like that. And they are coming up with a overall research program, and I think the money will be, but it is still in early stages. The problem that with the AI that I think which has been the case with the Indian science and technology is the involvement of the private sector, because all these are, the research is risky. The private sector is risk averse, and we don't have companies with deep pockets who can take this risk and put money for over long years, and so how to get the government, the academia and the industry together, but I think focus on startups, etc. So some of these issues are going to be discussed. See, there is a lot of knowledge in India about AI. There is no doubt about that. But it's all, we have failed in terms of putting it all together. That's why I said we don't have that high-tech industry. So up to a prototype you can go, but converting it into products has been our major failing. And I think whether you call it economic planners, whether you call it whosoever, I think that's where, because all the defense was essentially PSU, public sector enterprises. They were the ones who were doing it. But now we cannot just remain confined to PSUs. We have to go to the private sector. So a lot of thinking is now going on. Mr. Modi himself has talked about it. How to involve the private sector in this kind of research. So, see, one of the problems that India has faced, particularly in these high-tech areas concerning electronics, is that we missed the bus on hardware. So Indian electronics hardware is been unfortunately it hasn't come up. So we have depended on the import of electronics and hardware. Software there is ample, there is no problem, but hardware is a. So now government has come out with a new electronics policy, and I think they want to now come to the give some attention to hardware manufacturing, and Make in India will also probably do that. But this is where we are in terms of high-tech.
Okay, I've got three speakers on my list as of now. Dr. Rani Malan, Dr. Amitandipalut and Mr. Surya Narayana. What we might do is take the first two at one go and wait for somebody to couple up with Mr. Surya Narayana.
Hi, Rani Mullen. I'm a visiting fellow here at ISAS. I have two questions, actually, if I can sneak two in, if that's okay with the chair.
Two for one intervention.
Two for one. One is, I think, the Pulwama attack highlighted, sort of the the aging hardware on the Indian side in terms of outdated MiGs, etc. And I guess my question there is, how could it come there? Was it a weakness? Was it just a budgetary issue? Or was it the failure to be able to articulate what India needed to do, sort of the analysis of it, to put forth that argument? And the second question, and somewhat related to that, is there's the hardware and there's the software sort of, or soft power argument. And one thing that I keep on finding striking, and no matter what area you look at, but particularly when you come here, is also the grossly undersized Indian bureaucracy. And you mentioned think tanks and that India needs to, have more think tanks doing analysis, but even the bureaucracy itself is undersized. And so the capacity for analysis and forward-looking in terms of what is needed. So I'm wondering if you can comment on both of those issues.
Yeah, thank
Thanks.
you. Dr. Palit? Oh, no, you go.
Sir, thank you so much. I mean, of course, you're an insider and a veteran, so the insights are almost priceless in the sense that I think what you referred to and what many of us do feel at various levels of understanding of these issues is that the systemic handicap, the systemic shortcoming has actually been quite substantive in terms of a response to a group of challenges, and none of these challenges are now exclusive by themselves. I wanted to draw your attention to one specific aspect. You mentioned about data, you mentioned about cybersecurity, and I think year before last, India experienced almost 700,000 cyber attacks. There are reports. Now, I'm actually not getting into that area at all as to how this can be prevented or what are the reasons behind it. And as you again very rightly mentioned, there's a great deal of expertise within the country in terms of how this can be happened. It's the institutional and systemic response which has to be collected. But I'm actually coming to the more traditional areas. And I had two specific examples. One is the question of trade. There's a recent ruling which the WTO has given where it has ruled that Russia is permitted to maintain its trade sanctions on Ukraine because there is a situation of conflict between the two, and it can do so on national security grounds. Now, my argument is India is one of those countries which goes to WTO most frequently, has a very large number of running dispute cases, and sooner or later, national security is going to be a ground on which India is either going to be taken to the WTO on specific instances, or India itself will go to the WTO, bringing national security as an issue in trade matters. Now, I suppose this means that Commerce Ministry starts thinking very seriously about how trade influences national security, and they cannot disconnect it any further. And we see international examples where many countries are doing this, where they have merged foreign affairs and trade together. Canada has done, Australia has done, New Zealand has done, a number of other countries. But we don't see that in India. It's completely in silos. There's absolutely no connection to the thinking of security or the fact that trade has an enormous foreign policy, external engagement dimension to itself. This is never brought into the... And the second is that today I was reading the Ministry of Petroleum press release that from tomorrow the US sanctions on purchase of Iranian oil are going to become effective. And anticipating that, India and China have worked out a joint working mechanism. Now, my sense is that purchasing of crude oil at spot prices from the global market also has a security implication for the country in terms of how it influences the prices and the larger crude oil. So, has it been at all reviewed from that prism? I mean, has the Ministry of Petroleum ever been into consultation with supporting agencies? So, I think what you mention is absolutely correct in terms of where we need to go. But I'm just wondering, aren't there areas where we really need to brush up much further, even in the traditional areas. Because data, cybersecurity are obviously much later cutting edge issues, but even in current areas like trade or petroleum management, strategic reserves, don't we really have a lot more of coordinated thinking to bring into?
You have enough on your hands.
Yeah, no. I'll try and answer them briefly. Outdated equipment. I think this is very well known. It's an open secret. It's been talked about. You look at writings. I myself used to write maybe in the 90s. So people knew about it. So what is the problem? Resources, to an extent, yes. But more important has been our procurement procedures, which have been very, very tedious, extremely tedious. So we have, what defense procurement procedures, DPP we call it. I don't know how many, every other year they come out with a new version of it. But essentially, it takes anything between 5 to 10 years to, after projection, 5 to 10 years to procure. And it could be not just a big platform, it could be even. And how this happened, I think partly it's because of the Bofors thing. So it's all accumulated. And every government has tried to simplify those procurement procedures, but has not really succeeded. So this delays. So resources is one part, but I think this is where the maximum reform is required. That has not happened. And the second aspect has been the neglect of indigenization. It is nobody's case that a army or a armed forces as large as that of India, we still import 70% of our requirements from Russia, from USA, from other countries.
Even small arms.
Not small arms, big arms and small arms as well.
Yeah.
So small, big, all kinds of arms. So I think this lack, although the DRDO we set up way back in the 50s, and yet, the way we constructed our systems, methods, and all these rules, regulations, and all that sort of a thing. So there is a hurdle at every step. And the armed forces, because of the evolution of the security environment, they need everything now. And you don't blame them for it because the security environment has changed. And they would not get it. So I think this is a thing that we have got stuck in, and by and large this still operates. So while everybody knew that what is aging, what is not aging, what should be done, etc., but it takes a very long time. And every time you conclude a deal as it happened, somebody will come up, the political economy kicks in then, the politics kicks in, as it is happening in the case of Rafale now. So in India, you see, everybody has a veto on everybody else. That is the problem. So everything is going fine, and suddenly one editorial somewhere, one news item somewhere, and the whole thing comes crashing. That's the wages of being democracy of India kind. So this is, I think, where, but these will be sorted out because there is a greater focus on now indigenization. And there is a focus on the reform of the procurement procedures. So I hope that this will be sorted out. But in the end, we'll have to go the indigenization way. There has to be economics of it. We must create enough capacities in the country to be used by for within India and for defense exports. That's why defense diplomacy. The second point you mentioned was about undersized Indian bureaucracy. Now this is something new to me. I have always heard that we are oversized, we are bloated, bureaucracy is oversized. So I'm very glad that you mentioned, I think it's in the right places.
Quality bureaucrats.
In some places, we should not be over bloated. You're bloated in some places, but in right places you're undersized. I think that's a very pertinent question. But it is not that difficult. Again, I would first say it's the question of mindset. There are enough bureaucrats, even even think tanks. Even now, the think tanks, for instance, the number of think tanks in India has grown quite a bit in the last say 20 years or so, and they're all becoming more and more important. And there are a large number of youngsters who want to now come and join think tanks, and our ministries are now taking interns, young interns, which was unheard of. Our government is now taking, maybe in small numbers, but they're taking at joint secretary level, they're taking lateral entries are happening. And in the economic side, there has always been induction of some fresh blood at the lateral, but maybe it will happen on the other. I think Indian bureaucracy is oversized as well as undersized, but as I said, it's a question of where you look for it. But what we need is not the numbers, what we need is a professionalization. For instance, the Ministry of Defense, we have a large number of bureaucrats, but if they were professionalized, if they knew the modern technologies, if they knew the modern methods of finance, if they knew modern methods of procurements, if they knew about the logistic chains, if they knew about these engagements, if they knew about these things, the same bureaucrats will produce much better. I think that is where we need to, and as I made the point about diplomats, our diplomats have to not just issue statements, they have to understand this region very well, the trends very well, and they have to combine. They are all very bright and but only a few hundred of them. Probably they can increase that number. Already probably we are increasing our batches of our Indian Foreign Service are now increasing. Maybe we'll go up to 2,000 in a few years' time, but it can't go beyond that. But we can co-opt many people. If the Indian Ministry of External Affairs could co-opt the number of think tanks that we have, the same purpose will be set. You see, like negotiations, difficult negotiations like the trade negotiations or RCEP negotiations. You go to any other country, they come with army, battery of the experts, economic experts, trade experts, and legal experts, etc. Whereas our delegations are very small delegations, one or two people, etc. Because that hesitation to involve more people is still there. So I think it's more of a mindset change than is the number. I don't think we are going to get too many people into this. That is probably not, but mindset change and the method of working, that is what is required. So you mentioned about trade. I'm glad you mentioned that. Again, this is a first for me that a economist is talking about national security and saying that trade is a strategic issue.
The Americans are saying it also.
No, they are saying now,
Yeah.
and they are saying it, but whether our economists are saying that or no. So in that sense, it's a.
We have arrived.
So I think this book is precisely about this only. That you must strategize. In fact, I didn't talk about it. I also talked about culture here. And that is very important with the context of Southeast Asia. We must strategize, these things. So trade has to be strategized. And today the wars are not about the shooting ammunition at each other, but about trade. So I entirely agree with you. You see, this question of merger or working together of Commerce Ministry and the External Affairs Ministry is very old. Even when I was a probationer, we used to hear about it. But there always used to be these turf wars, the IAS and the IFS and the usual turf war between different cadres, etc. But today, in my think tank, I work with commerce secretaries, and in fact, I am inviting them to come and tell me what is the larger picture on trade and how is national security linked with it. And they are willing. The same bureaucrats who till yesterday would not hear of it are today willing to come and talk to me in a strategic thinking think tank about WTO and what it means for India's security. So I think things are changing, but more than that, we need expertise. So if we had a book, say, coming out, a person like you and others like you, who talk about trade and national security, I think, and if it's a joint collaborative effort, it will have a tremendous impact. If I, as a national security expert, write about trade and says, who are you? You don't know anything about trade. You don't know, you can't even buy and sell bread. So what are you talking about? But if you write and tell us that how trade and national security are linked, I think this will have a great thing. So this is a winds of change. This must happen. Oil, of course, we have always known. Oil has its strategic connotations, implications we have always known. And Iran oil, with all these waivers, etc., as we were discussing this morning also, I think it will, India has been here before. In the last round of sanctions, India managed to first reduce the offtake of oil from Iran, but continued with it. Iran liked, they were beholden to us, and we did some other rupee payment agreement. Today there are a little bit more options. You can work through Russia, you can work with China, etc. And European Union also has a payment mechanism. So I do hope that we don't, under American pressure, bring it to zero. Because Iran is very important. It's very important for us for access to Central Asia. And Afghanistan is very important. And Americans know about it. But they have their own internal politics. I think they will play out, this internal politics will play out. In any case, our offtake of oil from Iran has also already come down. Because individual companies who are dealing with Iran, they don't want to be on the wrong side of the American sanctions, etc. So this begins to happen. But for us, Chabahar is important, which is an Indian, Government of India's investment there. So this, I hope, will continue. But we'll have to play a very deft diplomacy here. I think the Americans will have to be told, but it's not that it's being told. And today, with America putting so much of focus on India for its Indo-Pacific strategy, I think we'll be able to do that tightrope walking that is required. I don't know whether I've answered your other question.
Mitanli, when you write your book, by the way, one of the things you might need to consider is the dependency of the Indian refineries, I think, on heavy sweet crude, which is only available in Iran and Venezuela, and also the rupee payment. So it's a double advantage procurement from Iran. So if the Indian market, of course, is still the market which will have to ultimately, I don't know, determine what the source of procurement should be, and I would assume that Indian diplomacy would need to be dovetailed to that. But the dependence on Iran, alas, might have to...
See, here, let me just make one point. The question is not of availability of oil today. There's enough oil going into the international... There's enough oil. It's only how do we maintain our relationship with Iran, and how does India show its strategic autonomy of decision making? That under US pressure, you simply put your Iranian offtakes to zero. Is it good or bad? I think that is the message. In terms of oil, I think many of our refineries have already adjusted. Mangalore, which used to get oil from Iran, is also changed. I think those are now issues behind us. It's not very important.
Okay.
But it's the larger picture. What message it will send? That is what is important.
Okay, Mr. Surya Narayana.
Surya from RSIS, formerly with ISAS. In '62, of course, China surprised India and subdued India. In 2017, at Doklam, India surprised China, and India, of course, did not subdue China, but then at least stood its ground, India. Has there been any study done? Maybe you were still the deputy NSA during Doklam crisis, if I'm not mistaken. Has there been any study done on Doklam crisis, how India managed it? Like the one how India bungled the Henderson report in '62. And secondly, we have spoken briefly about the Strategic Forces Command in the nuclear context. Is there any thinking to have a Space Force Command now that India has done ASAT tests successfully? Thank you.
Space like America, you say. Anyway, okay. Think big, yeah.
I think the difference between 1962 and 2017 is that was 1962 and this was 2017. India has changed. Today, India can stand up to China. I don't think anybody in India would have that doubt. And Doklam was one example. It was very simple. We were very clear that we were convinced of what was being done. We were quite sure of what the Chinese were doing. When you stood the ground, and we knew that if you stand firm with the Chinese will buckle down. This was at least the feeling within. Of course, there were concerns. The things may, some incidents may take place. This could have happened, and it may not remain confined to Doklam. It may go elsewhere, etc. But for that, I think, even given all the infrastructure development, etc., which China has done, this area, the Indian armed forces know it very well. And over the years, there's a lot that has been done. So I don't think, the 1962 can be repeated. So that is one. The question is of China's behavior. I always felt that you stand firm to China, and China will then have a new look at it. And I think Masood Azhar is also another example that comes to mind. Of course, we need to analyze it a little further. It has happened only yesterday. But the Chinese are pragmatic people. They are looking at Indian economy. They are looking at India-US relations. They are dealing with India in the Russia-India-China trilateral. They are dealing with India in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. BRICS is extremely important both for Russia and for China. And India is a very important partner. Today, India brings so much more on the table than was the case before. And the Chinese know it very well. And India is contributing so much to the Chinese economy, $60 billion. So, you see, so there are many, I think, the Chinese are pragmatic people, but we don't have to unnecessarily provoke anyone. The question is that, as I said in the morning, that there are 3 or 4 very big issues, structural issues which impact India-China relations. Boundary being one, China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean, China's growing influence in our neighborhood, etc. Then Masood Azhar was one, but terrorism, we'll have to see how NSG is another area. These are the 4 or 5 big issues on which, if we can't resolve them, at least we know how to manage this. That is what we have to, and both countries are doing it. As I said, 1967 onwards, not a bullet has been fired, despite the very tense situation very often on the borders. But India and China realizes it. India is also a rising power. India is no pushover. I think these kind of things, the messages go. Of course, the asymmetry is very much there. I mean, there is, but then asymmetry at what level? India today is a $2.5 trillion economy. Okay, it might become even $4 or $5 trillion economy in the next 8-10 years. So all this is, and if there is an adverse fallout of China-US trade dispute, then probably India is the one which everybody will be making a beeline to India. So all this is, I think, because India is a growing economy. So it's really on the comprehensive national strength and not just the military strength that I think the countries deal, particularly at that level, they deal with each other. So if we could handle some of these issues that the lady there talked about, this aging equipment and all that, if we can strengthen our defense manufacturing, if we can streamline our procurement methods, if we can indigenization, if we can put some money in that and get something out of it. Tejas is a very good example. This light combat aircraft, the Indian Air Force has now inducted it, and we may be able to, after we get all this assembly lines going, in a few years we may be able to actually export them. So India is changing, and the Chinese, I think, are getting that message. So yes, it will be a difficult relationship to manage, but we have managed it so far, and we will manage it.
Your asked question, I mean,
You
part
had
of it was,
sorry.
John Dalby had written a book called The Himalayan Plunder. So are you asking that will there be a Chinese counterpart to it in Doklam?
Then you had a question on space force. Look, the ASAT test is a offshoot of our ballistic missile defense. The technologies have been developed. But as I was saying, space is now going to play an increasingly important role in a country's national security. India is no exception. India already has something like almost 40-some satellites in space, having launched more than 120 satellites so far. So huge amount of ground network assets, space assets. So all that security is important. So India's, we set up in, I think it was in 2007, we mentioned it here, 2007, a space cell in the, what they call the Integrated Defense Staff, which was an offshoot of the Kargil Review Committee. So space has been looked at together. with now this ASAT test, the focus is now coming onto the space security. So I think what India now needs to do is to come out with a proper space security policy, which will have how are you going to use space, what are the institutions that you will set up, where will the resources come from, what will be the space doctrine, etc. So this is the thinking. A lot of thinking has been done over the years. Even many think tanks have also. Even my earlier think tank IDSA, we wrote a book on India's space security. So without a space command, which is probably not necessary, but without a space command, how to use space for national security and for national for our economic development, and how to defend our assets. This is and of course, and how to come up with these international norms. And India is a part of all the conventions and agreements which have been signed in the area of space. But now what this ASAT does is that India gets a seat at the high table. See, in the nuclear case, we missed that. This time we will not miss it. That is the main message of this ASAT. So without this space command, I think all that needs to be done is being thought about. Yeah.
Can I just add to this one question though?
Yeah.
You see, one reason why in space capabilities, if India develops the capability of shooting down an oncoming missile from space, which is what the Reaganite Star Wars was about, which was considered destabilizing because you are denying the adversary the capacity to strike you in retaliation. Now, as long as India does surveillance, which is what it's doing, it will be seen as stabilizing because no one can challenge surveillance. But if you arm those assets, the problem might be that you might unleash another space nuclear war in South Asia. I mean, this is just a thought. I'm sure.
No, this is a very good question and very large question, and I think we must discuss this question. India has made, and even after this space test, I think there was a FAQ which the Ministry of External Affairs had issued. India is not for weaponization of space.
Yeah.
It is. We don't want weapons to be placed in space. But we also realize that the space regime is not strong enough. You see, the way to discuss disarmament is in the CD, Conference on Disarmament. But this has been blocked for ages. So I think India will never, but India also doesn't want to be left in the lurch like it was done on the nuclear side, because it did enormous harm to Indian security. So I think it's in some sense a technology demonstrator, which is nothing very different from the BMD or striking a it used to be considered destabilizing. Probably it is destabilizing. But look at what they are doing now. Now they are going for supersonic Mach 20 unmanned aeroplanes which can come and strike you. And the deterrence, nuclear deterrence, the biggest danger today will be these hypersonic weapons. The hypersonic weapons will provide the maximum damage to the conventional deterrence. So I think we are entering into a totally new area, and we must discuss. But the question today is, when the ASAT is done by the Americans or by the Russians way back in the 80s and by the Chinese in 2007, nobody talks about it. And the debris created by the Chinese ASAT, which was a high altitude, high orbit, that was I think 800 or 900 kilometers. I don't know how much was it, about that much. And ours was about 300 kilometers. So this debris is already gone now. It's the amount of debris. They did some simulations, and they said that it will disappear in about 6 weeks. I think we are already almost 4 weeks. So the debris is already started going down, and in 6 weeks there will be no debris left. So there is no danger in that sense. But yes, this I think as a technology demonstrator and as someone who can now contribute to the further evolution of space regime, international regime, that is where I think the real message of this is based.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is, of course, the resolution prevention of armed conflict in outer space. But
Yes,
given
the
given
Moon
the
Treaty,
situation,
the
yeah,
Moon Treaty
given the
1967.
situation in the Conference on Disarmament,
Yeah.
I mean, it's getting nowhere. I want to thank all of you for participation in what was really an excellent seminar. This was a seminar with a difference because to date we have looked at symposia on issues like foreign policy as policy statements one way or the other. But yours is different. We have addressed some core issues which are probably more fundamental to policy than to date has been given credit for in our countries. Thank you very much for bringing these thoughts to the table. Director Arvind Gupta, we want to acknowledge it with gratitude, and we hope we shall display our gratitude by bringing our hands together for it. Thank you very much. There is tea to be had outside, and then